All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Parallax Viewer channel. I am your host, Andrew the Big Signorelli, Big Sig, and I am really excited for this conversation because we have a friend of the show and returning guest, Daniel Tutt. For those of you who may not know, Daniel Tutt is the host of the Emancipations channel and podcast. He also hosts study groups on Marxism and psychoanalysis via the Emancipation channel. We are currently doing a psychoanalytic reading group on Seminar 9, and also reading of Reading Capital by Althusser and Co. He's also the author of Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, Crisis of Initiation, which was published in the Palgraves, and then also the author of the recent How to Read like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche, which has been quite popular, and a lot of people have been having you on the channel to talk about it. That will be something that we'll do in the future, but I think right now, what really sparked this discussion we're about to have is this interesting text by Argentinian Marxist by the name of Leon Rozitchner. And the text for the audience and the learners out there is called Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism. And I first learned about this text from Daniel. He had the translator, Bruno Bostiels, on to talk about the text. And I was really intrigued by this, I guess you could say, combination of understanding bourgeois ideology and capitalism, not only from the standpoint of Marxist theory, but aligning Freud and claiming that Freud's theory undermines the bourgeois subject. Now, from a Lacanian lens, we could see, yeah, of course, that would make sense. Lacan does have a critique of liberalism and other forms. He's even critical of Marxism, but to say Freud has an implicit, if not explicit, critique of bourgeois society is something, in my opinion, radical and even bizarre from the outside perspective. So I guess to start the conversation, Daniel, who is this figure, Leon Rozitchner? And why is he so interesting? And why is this text so critical?
So he was an Argentinian Marxist, Freudian thinker who did his PhD at the Sorbonne. Actually, it was on Max Schiller's phenomenology, and he did it with Merleau-Ponty. And, he was sort of in the same milieu as the Althusser Lacan sort of 68 milieu in France, but became a kind of a very, very prominent Latin American intellectual who was involved with the Cuban Revolution. A very notable intervention that he made, which probably is the one that made him the most recognizable in the Latin American leftist scene, was an intervention about at the moment of the Bay of Pigs and the Contras, where he actually did a series. He led a series of interviews of captured Contras, and then published these interviews. It's not translated, but the text could roughly be translated to some. The whole text is not translated into English. In fact, Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism that we're talking about today is the only text that's fully translated. He wrote another book on St. Augustine, but only part of it is translated. But anyways, this one on the Cuban Revolution is absolutely fascinating. And it is called Bourgeois Morality and Revolution. And these interviews begin to introduce Rositchner to a wider project of a kind of understanding of the kind of rudiments or the kind of foundation of bourgeois individualism. And one of the things that he's very concerned about regarding bourgeois individualism is this idea of reality and kind of in the classic Freudian sense of reality testing, but also in the sense that bourgeois individualism has a kind of the common motif that he identifies here in these interviews with the Contras, and these are sort of like figures who were captured in attempting a coup d'état or an overthrow of the Cuban Revolution, the Socialist Revolution. And he notices that all of their rationales could could have no linkage to a kind of collective body. So this distinction between the individual and the collective is very central for Rositchner. And he thinks that this is at the heart of Western civilization. And he thinks that Freud identifies a series of social truths regarding individualism that unlock or sort of reveal the barriers to a kind of collective, a horizon of collective reality, a horizon of emancipatory rationality. And so he reads Freud with a very, very interesting Marxist lens that I think we could say a lot about the reading method that he brings out in this text. I think it's extremely important. But more generally, he was a communist intellectual, deeply involved uh, in Argentina as a critic of Peronism, which was kind of like this social democratic government. And he really made his mark. I mean, he was a very well-known figure in Latin American Freudian Marxism. He is a critic of Lacan. Lacan does appear, perhaps in a kind of tangential way, in Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism. And I have some theories as to where Lacan is being polemicized against, which we can talk about. I have some ideas about that. Althusser is also being polemicized against in this book. We can identify some of those points. But you see, Rositchner is trying to um, come at this rapprochement between Freud and Marx, which many people have been doing, from Deleuze and Guattari to Marcuse to Norman O'Brown to a whole range of thinkers, to Eric Fromm, right? And I think that his findings may be amongst the most productive in the Freudian Marxist kind of wider canon. Is my conclusion. My conclusion is that Rositchner gives us almost something unsurpassed in terms of its precision. We can talk about the text. I don't know if you want to get into sort of an overview of the sort of methodology. Perhaps that might be a good place to go next, but sort of like what is the methodology that he brings to bear? Because it's very different than a lot of the methodologies of other Freudian Marxists. It's a tragedy that more of his work is not translated into English. If comrades are fluent in Spanish and can read Spanish well, that would be a real treat to engage with Rositchner. Um, but that I think that gives us a sort of an overview of him.
Yeah, no, like because he has another one that's called like Freud in Power, and that one's not translated at all into English. Of course, the one on Augustine, which I think also has to do with the history of guilt and the superego. Um,
Yeah,
and then like he's got some
yeah.
other ones that are like various essays on materialism. But I do think, yeah, going
He's. Let me just say one thing about that. One of the things that Rositchner is influenced by is, of course, all of the main currents in Western philosophy of the time, including existentialism, psychoanalysis, phenomenology, and Marxism, of course. And one of the points that I think, as a Latin American Marxist, is Catholicism becomes a sort of the locus for a type of for the need to understand subjectivity that a lot of revolutionary Marxists had moved away from. This kind of goes to the St. Augustine work, but it also goes to his own conception of a very early text that he wrote called The Left Without a Subject. And the argument in this intervention, which I think is more almost like a manifesto, if I'm not mistaken, is precisely the idea that psychoanalysis is necessary for revolutionary socialist practice, because within the Marxist canon, we don't have a fully formed theory of the subject. And I think one of my contentions might be that a lot of his emphasis is on corporeality, on the body, and on death, and the way that Christianity um, has developed a type of um, subjectivity that conceals and sort of manages um, existential suffering and dread in a very particular way, and a very advanced way, right? In a way which the revolutionary tradition is almost like struggling to provide an alternative to in a certain way, right? So that's actually one of the beautiful things about Rositchner's work is that in a way, uh, he casts the conception of the revolutionary subject, right, as something that is not sort of born in some kind of fantastical netherworld, but is actually like you can tell that the way that he's making interventions, right? And this may be like a kind of historicist reading of Rositchner, is definitely in the context of like Guevara's movement, like in the context of real socialist revolutionary potential, the Cuban Revolution, like real historical history. So like the historical possibility is present, right? So in that sense, one can see probably why he has a certain degree of disenchantment with a lot of like, existentialism and kind of French philosophy, which does not necessarily see revolution at its own doorstep,
Right.
right? But
Yeah.
he certainly does, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why, like, to touch on a few points before he transitions to into the methodology, he says at the beginning, like, politics has a subject, but the science does not. If science had a subject, it would have to include itself in the pursuit of truth, and it would be to reveal the distance in us instantiated by, a bourgeois society. So like there's this sort of internal and external distance that we experience, and he relates it to this like notion, because he does use the term subject a lot, but it's also embedded with the concept of corporeality that you mentioned, and I think that comes from like the way he wants to view what he means by a subject. And he even goes far as to say, to your last point, our thesis consists in affirming that every subject is also the nucleus of historical truth. And I think that kind of ties into this point about like the truth of our time, or the social truth that manifests in a sort of conjuncture. And I think he probably saw that in Guevara, and being around the Cuban Revolution, and
Right,
even like I guess so far as to say, like, what would a group and a leadership look like in the Freudian sense that
right.
would not fall into some sort of paternalistic relationship, or some sort of like movementism or populism, I guess, to even go so far as to say that, or just like, the sort of disconnection that we see in
Yeah,
individuals.
that's exactly right. What he's
Yeah.
very concerned with is a conception both of institutions and of leadership that he sees as implicit in Freud's group psychology,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's the core of so much um, learning that the revolutionary movement can gain from psychoanalysis and Freud in particular, right? Precisely because um, once one has methodologically supplanted all of the social categories that Freud develops into the system of production, into the capitalist system of production, both the ontogenetic and the phylogenetic basis of the subject, right? That transition from nature to culture, right? That core idea of the birth of the superego itself, right? The core kind of premise of the origin of civilization itself, he theorizes as something which, in fact, is posited as transcendable, but only transcendable by a confrontation with the mode of production itself. So he's literally saying we can read Freud in a way which would, and even though Freud is speculating about revolutionary groups and spontaneous groups, right? Um, in that speculation, Rositchner is able to extract, like, and formalize a much more elaborate conception of human freedom at a collective level. So we can kind of get into some of these things because, in a certain way, what what Freud is theorizing regarding the kind of sickness of man, of the bourgeois individual, right, has to be first, I think, first and foremost, sort of established.
No,
Not it has to be established not as some type of and here I think it's like an interpretive move that's very unique on Rositchner's part, where he talks about what is the true origin of guilt in civilization, and where do things like morality and conscience, in fact, derive from in Freud's conception. And we can, I want to build in, discuss all of those points, but
yeah.
what I'm just trying to say at the outset, right, is that what this book is trying to do is take very seriously the entirety of Freud's social writings, right? Um, Including his two works on religion, the group psychology work, Civilization and Its Discontents, um, the new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, but I mean a lot of others too. He
Yeah, like
does make
sometimes he'll reference interpretation of dreams,
he starts
but
off with that. He starts
yeah.
off with interpretation of dreams. So he does reference kind of, let's say, the whole Freudian canon, but the main emphasis is going to be on the social writings.
Mhm.
Um, and again, like the kind of outcome of all of this is the argument, and this is what I think is very novel, is that things like, I'll give you an example, things like the death drive, and this is where I think his contrast with Lacan could not be more evident or more clear. He says are um, derivative of the system of production, which instills a kind of constitutive aggression. And in fact, moreover, um, the institutions of civilizational life, what Freud will call in group psychology the artificial groups, have a kind of function to maintain a baseline of aggressivity in a certain way. In other words, um, left unto themselves, artificial groups, which Freud initially theorizes as, of course, the church and the army, as we all know, but Rositchner, I think, wishes to extend. He says, wait a second, what if we actually thought of the artificial groups? And I've always thought this myself, this is essential, beyond just the two dominant institutions of liberal democracy, the church and the army. But why couldn't they be extended in a certain way? Or perhaps rather, the church and the army are only like the kind of most exemplary expressions of this particular tendency of repression, right? Of a particular form of institutional leadership and domination.
Which is interesting because, like, even though he is very critical of Althusser and the Althusserians, I can't help but see almost a similar resonance with Althusser insofar as we talk about the RSA and the ISA. And
Uh-huh.
I even think for Rositchner, in the expanding of like what an artificial group could be, I think he even talks about the corporate body, like the bureaucracies of like institutions of capitalism, insofar as like they are expanding the relations of production as well, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, but of course, this is just a build up because we're gonna touch on this because in the end he starts to go into depth with this with group psychology. But with the methodology, as we pointed out, he's reading Civilization as Discontent, Group Psychology, and the new introductory lectures. And what's so interesting about his reading is that not only is it like a sort of exegetical exercise, but he's also expanding on premises from Freud and truths that Freud realizes. And I think like compared to like other social thinkers that want to engage Freud in a social way, like whether it's Eric Fromm, like Frankfurt School, or like other like Freudians, there's almost like I would just say like just to use Frankfurt School as an example, a way into which they want to say that the working class is dead or it's pacified, right? But I don't think
Mm.
that's what Rositchner is doing, nor is he also trying to create a sort of revisionism in Freud as well? Like he's taking Freud as his word and his discovery in the social writings. I think like the only person I could think that really takes his social writing seriously, besides Rositchner, would be like Lacan, because like when you look at the seminars, he's always engaging with the social writings as well, like group psychology, and civilization as discontent, the modern subject. Um, but like transitioning to like the beginning of the work, what I find really fascinating, and this is almost like a similar move that Slavoj does, is that he starts with, like we said, the interpretation of dreams to construct civilization based around sickness, right? Or the symptom, right? And I even think he says that Marx, invents the symptom like Zizek, but what that means is that the dream is important for Freud because it's not as though we dislocate ourselves from the social and we enter into private life in our sleep. No, the unconscious and the wish fulfillments that are constructed in the dream are residues and latencies that uh, manifest reality, right, in a more intimate form, or you could say ideology. And he plays with this common trope of the inside and the outside that we see common in psychoanalytic tropes. But I just find this interesting because he's expanding off of like this idea of like there's this um, hallucination that structures the dream, and we had this sort of primal satisfaction, and as we enter into reality, we end up desiring what we had lost. And so in that sense, like I see him not only aligned with Freud, but I can't help but to also see like his clarity in reading psychoanalysis that we even see in Lacan as well. But this idea that for Rositchner at least, this loss, this dissatisfaction is constitutive of civilization itself. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I just find this beginning part fascinating. He's trying to establish the bourgeois individual, the subject, in relationship to the formation of the unconscious in dreams.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's in a sense, there's a question about um what civilization, according to Freud, what the sort of scandal of civilization is about, all revolves around the kind of primary kind of locus or maxim revolves around the incapacity for the objective discernment of reality. And if you think about that as a socialist, one of the, traditions of the socialist tradition in the 19th century, of course, is coming out of this um, kind of Hegelian thrust regarding, um, and we see this a lot in, say, like Lukács, or even in Engels, say in Engels's philosophy of anti-Düring, there becomes a way in which bourgeois ideology has a problem with fetishism, and reality is kind of um, enclosed or is covered over. Now, this uh, creates a condition that makes um, the capacity for the discernment of reality, and this is where like guilt comes into play, right? Whereby a subject that is, um, and this is also like religion and Christianity as well, because in a certain sense, it's almost like a technology of social control, precisely because what the opiate effect of religion, one of its effects is a further consolation to a separation from and a distancing from the capacity to discern objective reality, right? And I felt that this is so powerful as a motif of for socialism, precisely because I've always felt that even though we are not necessarily thinking about ideology as false consciousness, I think that this kind of general sort of motif of ideology as false consciousness is sort of in air, or it's sort of inadequate. But at the same time, I am of the view, and I think Rositchner helps us see this even further, almost like as a kind of revolutionary provocation to us, right? which is that only in moments of revolutionary agitation, or when we face the real of the class struggle, or when um, social antagonisms are located, right? When the reality of the situation is opened up. I mean, here we're thinking of also the tradition of socialist realism itself in art and literature, which would be its objective, which would be tied back to the same problematic. And so you see Freud is immediately inducting us into this same pedagogic orientation, right? Which, we don't maybe see socialist um, projects or sort of building class consciousness in that way. But one of the things that Rositchner made me think about a lot is that perhaps we should. Perhaps Rositchner is bringing out a new rationality, a new reason, right? A new realism for the opening up of the discernment of objective reality. Precisely because that discernment is itself a type of painful process. It's a painful process, right? And what bourgeois institutions, okay, and bourgeois individualism prefers is concocting what he calls false, like falsifying the real or falsifying reality. And this is sort of like you could also think about this vis-a-vis the motif of fantasy and narcissism. And that's actually one of the points that I think is very well stated in Rositchner, especially when he gets to his conversation on what a leader is. One of the overarching claims that Rositchner makes that I find extremely accurate is that in capitalist institutions, you actually don't technically have leaders. You have managers of discontent whose role is to basically concoct a kind of paternalistic reliance on those institutions to keep the subjectivities in a relationship of dependency. And so one of the things that's important apropos Rositchner's thinking of reality is the function of the mother. Now, here, Rositchner, unlike Lacan, tends to theorize this function of kind of narcissism as a type of imaginary totality that keeps the subject mired in a kind of, um, well, it keeps the subject away from a confrontation with the father. So he has a very interesting, almost like politicized theory of the confrontation of the Oedipus complex on a political terrain, where, to paraphrase at one point, he says the objective of overcoming the Oedipus complex, because he's not an anti-familialist exactly. I mean, again, because he's in a Latin American, highly Catholic religious culture. He says the objective is to equip the father, to bring the father out into the site uh, uh, where they themselves are sheltered from reality. In other words, the father is not to be kind of perfunctorily abolished or is the source of a kind of immediate evil or something like this. But he says, in essence, that the father is also a victim of the system of production, and that moreover, um, the myth of the primal father, Rositchner gives us what you might call, and I love his theory here, and I want your take on this. I know that you probably found it compelling as well. He says that we can think the kind of phylogenetic residue of the primal father as immanentized or immanently existing within the mode of production itself. And that when we rebel against the source of the real of the mode of production itself, we are in a sense seeking to address that phylogenetic repetition that haunts social life, right? We are addressing that residue of what he calls the collective superego, right? Because the residue of the primal father exists as this kind of collective superego, right?
Yeah.
And I found that to be very, very interesting and very a very because a lot of psychoanalytic Marxists, when they theorize the Oedipus complex, let's say in a terrain of militant radical politics, they become very anti-familialist, right? So they tend to literalize mother and father, not as like symbolic functions, but as like literal incarnations of objects that must be destroyed. And that's not what Rositchner is actually saying. Okay. So it's sort of like a more cooperative conception of the family. While at the same time, he has a lot of passages about the way that the subordination of the bourgeois family um, kind of mires each subject in relations of either sort of motherly, narcissistic, negative dependence or aggressivity, conditions of aggressivity, right? Um, but again, apropos the question of aggressivity, I found it very interesting his conversation on the death drive, you may remember, where he says there is no death drive in a pure biological state. He wants to actually think death drive more so as a cultural
It's a culture
imposition.
as a culture imposition in which aggression expresses itself, right? But he even clarifies to say that we shouldn't reduce the death drive down to um, aggression or aggressivity, but rather it is a sort of cultural artifice in which aggression has an outlet, you could say. Um, I think that's how he says it. But
Yes, exactly, exactly. And also, moreover, one of the things he says here that I find interesting and maybe an implicit rebuttal to some Lacanian theories of the death drive is that, the revolutionary leader holds the capacity to do something that other leaders within bourgeois institutions are incapable of doing. And that is that they hold the capacity to construct new ideals.
yes, yes.
And so he has like a whole theory of leadership and ideals which allow for a different relationship that's no longer a dependent one. So what I have the feeling that Rositchner is offering in a practical but also optimistic sense is a way to think about the construction of socialist institutions that would be free from some of these um, dependencies, which are ultimately, in a materialist sense, dependencies born from the capitalist system itself,
Yeah,
right? And so what's interesting about that though, it's not that Freud directly theorizes that source, that materialist source in the mode of production. He doesn't. But by superimposing it, what all we do is we gain more. We don't convolute Freud. No, we enrich Freud. We enrich it. You see? So in the same way that even though Freud says very little about the revolutionary groups, Rositchner enriches by giving this architecture, this scaffolding, this he builds this whole system around it, you know? And but it's one that is fully in concert with it. So in that sense, he's very much like Lacan, insofar as he's staying very, very true to Freud. So it's not some kind of like hyper revisionism or something like that. So I don't
mm-mm.
think he's really compromising Freud at the end of the day.
No, not at all. And I think like you could see him infidelity with Freud with the way he reads him, going back to the dreams and the term that was repeated a lot in your discussion is the superego. And we got to remember that like when Freud first develops the superego, or prior to him using the term superego, he has this notion of the censor, right? And the censor
Yes.
is going to be on the same plane as not only repression, but the manifestation of the superego at the level of the dream. And what's so
Mm-hmm.
interesting about the dream is that it's sort of structuring of a sort of psychosis, right? But in order for us to not fall away from reality, what links us to reality while we maintain the dream and our symptom is precisely its conversion via the ego, right? But the ego also is fragile and weak. The ego is not only in wakeful consciousness, but also parts of the unconscious as bourgeois identifications. But what makes the superego so interesting for Rositchner is that he says that this is sort of personalization of the structure itself, right? And unlike the Lacanian or the Zizekian approach of the superego as purely just the injunction to enjoy, what I like about his reading of the
Yes.
superego is that what the superego is censoring is the site of an originary violence or an originary trauma, which goes back to what you were talking about the primal horde, this investment and dependency of the mother, which could be what Freud will call Anlehung or anaclitic, translated by Strachey, this sort of dependency, or it could be
Mm.
narcissistic. But at the same time, the anxiety and fear of being cut off, killed, or castrated is also at the foresight via the father, but it's the killing of the father and the instantiation of guilt by the superego uh, is what the superego is actually masking. And how does it do that? Well, this is where, in his reading of Freud, not only of totem taboo and civilization of discontent, but his theories of religion, that religion creates a new society, a fraternity, a brotherhood, with his Franciscan injunction of love thy neighbor or universal love. Universal love is that sort of maxim that becomes a sort of super egoic injunction, while also at the same time masking the traumatic origins of the subject or just what binds civilization together. And I found that a very interesting reading. And in a historical level, it would make sense why he focuses so much on not just religion but Christianity, since he's coming from Latin America, and
Yeah.
the phylogenetic um, passing down of the superego via Christian love, right?
No, it's really nice, and it's true. It's there's two movements to the superego. There's this first um movement, which is an exterior movement prior to, I mean, in a technical sense, Freud develops a early conception of the superego before his discoveries in Beyond the Pleasure Principle as the superego basically as this form of censorship. But then after the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the superego is also the source of an internalized aggression, but that source has its kind of relay back into what you were talking about, the origin of this um, guilt complex over this killing of the primal father, which permeates and forges almost like the kind of bedrock of the social contract that makes civilization itself like its foundation in a certain way. And what I found interesting is that what you just articulated in a certain way is that um, this condition is one that revolt and class struggle push up against. So it's not as if it's not as if politics or political activity is somehow not fraying or touching the edges of the collective superego. No, in fact, I think the point is that um, the condition of subordination, of subjective subordination, is is mutated. It's a very almost like dialectical theory of how revolutionary politics can mutate our relationship to social forms of domination and control, such that okay, how can we, and so here it's interesting though in a certain way because he's trying to think, I think, in the context of Peronism, right, which would be like a kind of large scale social democracy where the debate among socialists was whether this constitutes a breach from bourgeois continuity, or whether it's kind of like as a complex social arrangement. Like, say, if you take like another Argentinian Marxist like Laclau, people say that Laclau develops a whole theory of left populism built off of valorizing Peronism in a certain way. Now, this is not what Rositchner is saying. Rositchner concludes, in fact, that Peronism repeats bourgeois forms of leadership and personality and so
Which
on.
is such a good point, because this is why, you know, again, we'll get into this later, but to get on this key point, what differentiates Freud and Rositchner's reading of Freud compared to Laclau is that Freud is investigating groups and, distinguishes groups and develops, as we've been saying repetitively, a theory of a revolutionary group. Whereas it seems like for Laclau can't think groups. He only thinks of masses in the same way, where he really aligns with Le Bon, right? And I find that really
Well,
fascinating.
okay, so I wouldn't say that Leclau aligns with Gustave Le Bon. We should definitely introduce Gustave Le Bon because, and so this is very interesting to kind of do a comparison between Ernesto Laclau and Leon Rozitchner. I think we should do that. But first, one of the claims that he makes in the book, okay, is that where one can identify Freud's political content in group psychology is that Freud makes it evident in a way that the text is a polemic against Gustave Le Bon. And Gustave Le Bon was a very prominent bourgeois social scientist who created what Rositchner refers to as the kind of penultimate social science of groups and crowds of his time, right? So this is like late 19th century all the way up to some of the events that really inspired Freud to write group psychology, such as the Spartacist uprising in Germany, the communist uprising in Germany, 1917 in Russia, etc., right? Obviously, you have a whole range of extremely vibrant and frequent socialist uprisings during this time. So Gustave Le Bon basically was interested in trying to um, concoct a type of theory of irrationalism that would cast uh, uh, sort of psychopathological um, determinations on any uprising of the masses. And so a lot of this is tied into in a tangential way to Freud's critique of mesmerism, because one of the theories that was sort of prominent at this time that was a worry for the bourgeoisie in general, of course, is that charismatic individuals of revolutionary groups have the capacity to mesmerize the revolutionary group. Now, one of the things that Rositchner will say is that Freud has a positive view on revolutionary groups precisely because Freud theorizes the revolutionary leader as himself as capable of forging that same bond of love that he sees as elemental or essential to the constitution of any group. And in fact, Rositchner takes that even further and says, yes, indeed, what the function of the revolutionary leader is about is the identification of the group's collective dissatisfaction and the kind of converting of that dissatisfaction into a bond of love. So it's not necessarily that they have reproduced the father, because it's two different types of fathers. On the one hand, you have a bourgeois father, which keeps the subject bound up with a maternal dependency through this imaginary totality. It's kind of like a passive theory of subjectivity, ultimately. So that's another beautiful thing, because undergirding this is really the outcome of the revolutionary group is the cultivation of a more liberated subjectivity that would come through the identifications, because the identifications that are bound up with bourgeois artificial groups keep the subject pacified in a certain way, either pacified in a narcissistic state, which is a repetitive image of the bourgeois manager of the group, or bound up with a kind of general form of dissatisfied aggression. The revolutionary leader identifies collective dissatisfaction, almost like you could say concentrates it and forms it into a new point of identification.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about this. You may remember this. For many years, in about, I would say like the 2010s and before, one of the big debates that we saw in continental Marxism, say like Badiou and Zizek and other philosophers, was this question about the human animal and mastery. It was the kind of a whole series of conferences and papers and books were written on this topic. And the question revolved around whether revolutionary groups need a sort of master figure to initiate some type of break from, the status quo, or to organize their libido, etc., to create like a line of a cathexis. And incidentally, for Ernesto Laclau, in his text on populist reason, right, he has a whole series of reflections on this precise question, right? And he ends up siding with Kopczak's theory of communities organized not around master signifier figures, but around object A. And so he kind of takes it that route out. What I was thinking would be an excellent intervention would be to compare Rositchner's theory of the revolutionary leader to these reflections, both from Badiou, Zizek, and Laclau, right? From all three. Because I think he's giving us something almost different than them. I think
Yeah,
he's
it's
giving us something
definitely
different,
yeah, it's definitely different, and because it's focusing on what you were saying about a revolutionary leader, where the group is not founded on a dependency or an identification that is exemplary of something paternalistic, but bounded by love. And love, of course, for Freud, is related to his theory of libido. And that's what he critiques Le Bon on, is because for Le Bon, groups are sort of held together by either a contagion, like a sort of sickness where all intellectual rationality is sort of jettisoned, where there's just nothing but affect, or it's by mesmerism. But even Freud will say that, well, mesmerism can't really hold one together because there's always someone who could be subjected to a counter suggestion. And this goes back to Freud's experimentation prior to the talking cure. He was experimenting with mesmerism, and he
right.
found it really hard to penetrate past the hypnotized thought because of the resistance of by counter suggestion. But the libidinal ties are what really bind the a group together, right? And even the family together. And this is where the Oedipus complex arises in the family, from the libidinal tie that is paternalistic and has that dependency on the mother, which can be narcissistic. I definitely want to talk more about the group as the conversation goes on, because this text is so rich, even though it's so small. But I really want to focus on this because we've talked so much about Freud, but Freud and Marx, insofar as that we both have a critique of religion. And the text that we referenced besides group psychology was Civilization as Discontent. And I want to get your thoughts on comparing Freud's theory of religion and its criticism with Marx, because Rositchner starts off the second chapter with quotes from Civilization as Discontent. for those of you who may not know, this is not only Freud's social writing where he investigates what civilization is founded on, but it's also a response to a playwright friend of his named Romain Rolland, who criticized his work called Future of an Illusion. And he says something to the extent that if religion is a part of humankind, it's because we have this faculty for oneness, right? That religion can be reduced down to the fact that man contains within a sort of category in his mind. And Freud kind of claps back by saying that if there's anything of this faculty of oneness, it stems from this sort of narcissistic union with the mother, right? This oceanic bliss that the ego wants to attain because it wants to avoid suffering.
Yeah, it's interesting. Rositchner argues that religion, science, art, and love, he says, are all hunted by death, but they hold back what he calls the obstacle that works inside of us to dissolve and separate our power from the collective power that confronts us. In the sense that what the problem of religion is in Rositchner's view is that it sort of creates a consolation for the subject that can only keep the subject in a kind of state of what he calls pain. So ultimately, religion and this whole motif of religion as an opiate and so on, I think in a certain way is perverse in this way that it treats the concealment of it provides, just like art, religion, and science also provide a solution to this problem of reality itself and the kind of painfulness of touching reality or discerning reality in culture, precisely because the origin of reality is coming from a traumatic scene, as Freud articulates in Totem and Taboo, and as we've tried to point out throughout this discussion. So religion is this kind of consolation that Rositchner, I mean, he's very opposed to the sort of operation or the solution that religion is trying to offer here. On the one hand, I think on the other hand, there is, I mean, there's a sense that, yeah, like religion also is like the artificial groups, keeping in mind that the church is the artificial group par excellence. What religion has mastered is the capacity to keep its subjects in abeyance, or rather in what he calls infantile dependency, right? And that this form of infantile dependency is sort of like what religion has perfected in a certain way. And that's what he calls individual narcissism, right? So, I mean, I feel as if there's a sense that there's a kind of operation also here on different relationalities that religion makes to the category of death that Rositchner is extremely interested in. And I have the feeling that Rositchner thinks that this kind of very powerful, I don't know, it's a very interesting, like almost like revolutionary treatment of the confrontation of being towards death that I see throughout this text. And there's a certain way in which, precisely because the revolutionary project, the revolutionary group, etc., is capable of upsetting our core relationality to death. It seems to me like a way in which Rositchner is almost helping us think this supplanting of religion in the same way that he's helping us think the supplanting of the bourgeois family, in the same way he's helping us think the supplanting, or we could say the sublation. In that sense, like maybe Rositchner is like the most dialectical Freudian Marxist of all time in this certain way, even at the level of our relationship to death itself, right? He actually wrote a book on Peronism and the theory of death as well, which is not translated. Because again, for him, death drive is bound up within culture. He does not want to biologize it, and nor does he want to think it along language and structural linguistics and Saussure and all of that. He doesn't think it vis-a-vis a theory of signifier at all. So there's something to that, and I just felt like, I mean, okay, but at the same time, taking a step back, I mean, I don't know what more you wanted to say about his treatment of like Moses monotheism and Freud's texts. I feel that there's probably some things to glean from that. Um, in a way, I suppose one of them, let's see here, would be that he talks about, um, yeah, I don't know. Well, first of all, let me ask you your take on like what exactly Rositchner says about Freud's text on religion that struck you first.
Well, I found it interesting because in the way he kind of aligns not just the text on religion, but the way that Freud frames um the faculty of oceanic oneness that Roland proposes, and kind of shows how really what Freud kind of does to one up Romain Rolland is to kind of align this criticism of religion to be exemplary of what Marx would call fetishism, right? Of reality, in which like there is this sort of totality that the bourgeois subject experiences, but it's almost a mystification
Mm,
of the social conditions vis-a-vis this narcotic that he describes it as, like religion
right.
as a narcotic. But even though religion is just like the sort of, you could say, the bedrock insofar as it establishes that structure of the subject and even the instantiation of the superegoic guilt, we have, as you listed, those other techniques to alleviate suffering and to avoid death or have that solution of death, which is,
Right.
science and art, right? But those are only temporary things. And so he then goes so far as to say, like, we could resort to religion or actual narcotics as to alleviate our pain. But
Right.
then we have two other things. We have the neurotic who tries to use their symptom, but even the symptom can end up causing more suffering in the long run. Um, and then the last part would be love relations with one another. But because of the discontent in society, this creates more antagonism, right? So it's very interesting how, like, you know, the frame of religion as sort of exemplary of like this fetishism and mystification of reality um, kind of propels one to organize these techniques of alleviating suffering, but only to cause more suffering and to build more tension, um, more suffering, but even more aggression towards everyone else. But in the guise of, again, this maxim of universal love, it's important not only to Rositchner, but also to Freud in the text of Civilization and Discontent. Um, and he even, I think this is where Zizek gets the whole thing, but like Freud's the one that says it, like the injunction to love thy neighbor as thyself is also an imposition to hate, thy neighbor, right? Because there's also an implicit self-hatred of the bourgeois subject, right? And I think that also goes back to the narcissism, right? The
Yeah.
narcissism is not only a dependency of the mother and of the image, but there's a lot of frustration and hatred into that as well, right? So in a sense, it's also kind of alienating, and so we don't necessarily react in self-destruction, but the destruction of others. So I think that also ties into this whole thing about the culture of the death drive, right? As not in the level of the signifier, nor on the level of biology, but sort of institutionalized, right?
It's institutionalized, and he says that the death drive has sort of predominance and can be correlated in an inverse relationship to the greater degree that the society is capable of maintaining social order, right? And that I think is very interesting as a theory of like crisis and decadence. So like in a way, if we think about capitalist society in stages of stability versus stages of chaotic breakdown and crisis, Rositchner would argue, like, that's why I was actually, just as an anecdote, like, you could almost apply Rositchner's theory of death drive here. For example, like, people were wondering why in the 1990s a lot of youth culture was extremely, like, excessively violent. Say, for example, if you watch those documentaries about Woodstock 99, and there was like people dying at this concert, and there's like extreme fights and very obscure racist activity and things of this nature. But then if you look at like the background bedrock of like general cultural stability, of course, the system was extremely stable in a certain way, which would almost like prove that there's a correlation there to a generalized increase in aggression a certain way. I feel that that's actually very, in some sense, very accurate in a certain way, right? Which is why, as Marxists and socialists, a bit of chaotic instability can be an opening for us in a certain way, um, where we can face, because I think that's the other thing that Rositchner wants us to rationally be capable of identifying in socialist organizations and parties, the repressed foundations that make aggression circulate and exchange and function, right? In a way, what he's calling for is a new itinerary of investigation into the underbelly that makes social repression possible. Like, it's locatable. It's locatable. That goes back to the whole point about why the father must be an ally to you in identifying the sources that make patriarchy like possible, in the same way as racism. You see the point? So I feel as if, again, it's like this realist equipment that he's giving us for, you could say, almost like cultural investigations into the underbelly of the collective death drive and of the collective superego. That these things are not contingent, but they are approachable, right? In a certain way, they're within our measure. They're imminent. They're imminent,
Well,
you know?
there's this line that he talks about, and I think it's like the only line where I actually see Rositchner use the term phallus. But in regards to the paternalism, he says, like, in Totem and Taboo, this whole myth around the primal horde and the murdering of the father is that, of course, they eat the father after, and this is where the guilt and the superego is instantiated and internalized. But what makes this brotherhood or civilization unique is that they are able to now take the place of the father, right? But the one thing that they can't do is enjoy the women or enjoy like the father. So they're caught in this sort of impotence, right? So I wonder if that kind of aligns when you take that logic to the culture or the institutionalization of the death drive, but also of aggression itself because of this embedded impotence and dependency on bourgeois culture, insofar as that it instantiates the law of the father,
Yeah.
its guilt, and also its impotence. And so this is why you see so much destruction and aggression, right?
Right. Well, that's actually the other thing, is that one of the points that he makes a distinction between sensibility and ideology. And it's a very useful kind of distinction in a way, because if one of the operations to sort of reveal bourgeois ideology would be around its uh, incapacity, or rather its particular treatment on the corporeal body. And he argues that the figure of the father in bourgeoisie, in like the bourgeois family and things like this, um, plays an ideological function, not a sensible role. And this is an interesting distinction. In a way, it's because the father functions, he says, as a stand-in that is blinded to its own, to the father's own complicity within the system of production that has determined him. And therefore, ideologically, the father can play the part of omnipotence. And keep in mind, I think there's a graph in the text. You may remember the diagram where and we could even put it up on the screen at some point, maybe after when you edit the video, we can put it up or something like that. It's worth looking at. But what you'll notice there is that he's very much talking about a society which had an efficacious name of the father and a patriarchal society. But even within that, he says that the task would be to open up the father away from the omnipotence that they are encouraged to imbibe ideologically and push them into what he calls this sensible touch with the corporeal realities of their body and of their condition and so on. Almost like, if the myth of the primal father is ultimately a myth about equality, and if it is a historical myth of repetition, right? Because it revolves around this idea of the kind of, I guess you could say, the constitutive mismeasure or inequality of the distribution of pleasure and enjoyment at the origin of society. Okay. Well, if society is founded off of this traumatic murder that makes possible the distribution of equality after it, um, in a sense, that same object that is now located, no longer instantiated in the one of the father, but is now instantiated in capital, in the heart of the mode of production itself. The father plays an ideological function to mystify. Uh, the father plays an ideological function in capitalism as required to be complicit with the omnipotence of capital itself. And that's precisely something that can be dislodged. That's a total mirage that can easily be dislodged, It's a political act to dislodge that, I think is what he's trying to say. So in a way, I find that very, very interesting. And that distinction between, and because also it's something which when you take down the ideological omnipotence of the father figure and you introduce them to what he calls sensibility, um he says you've introduced them to like a new relationship to death itself. And again, because he's always tethering with this status of death.
Yeah,
um
and it's so interesting because like he's really, I would say, really raw, really real about death compared to like the way it's usually conceptualized in existentialism or like Western philosophy, because he's not just talking about death in the existential way of like the being towards death in Heidegger, or like the opposite of life, but he's really political about it. He's talking about terror. He's talking about uh political and state violence in which the imminence of death is like right in front of us. Like it's very politically charged. It's not this sort of romanticization um of death. So that's why I also find pretty interesting about him is that like he's very contextual about that. But when like, the other hand, the death drive is also, as we've said, sort of this culturalization or institutionalization of something where aggression is sort of exerted. And I wonder if like that plays a part too with death, insofar as that death comes about in its imminence through terror and violence, right?
right. Well, it's like the revolution can only be successful on condition that the figures of fathers, that they are he says that they are inducted into being slaves to the power. Because again, what bourgeois civilization and its institutions inculcate subjects into is sort of like what Rositchner will frequently refer to as a kind of system of power, a system of power. And because Freud allows us to think forms of dependency that are structural and which are sunk in this particular way. What Freud also allows us to identify at the heart of our enslavement to a system of power is, and we should talk about this a little bit because it's sort of related to what you were saying, what Rositchner opens in the reflection on dreams and so on. He wants to make a claim that Freud helps us identify uh, the role of history in our own subjective freedom. So our own subjective freedom is capable of touching what Rositchner calls history. And this is obviously could be understood both from a Marxist lens, but also from a Freudian lens. And I want to invite you to maybe elaborate how you see the historical within the psychoanalytic subject that he's identifying. I think obviously in a Marxist sense, where the historical could be located would be in what Rositchner calls the break from uh, the homogeneity of the artificial group and our dependency on it into the heterogeneity that the revolutionary group brings us out of. Okay. And it's that movement from homogeneity to heterogeneity that requires, the cultivation of, I would argue, new virtues, new ideals, a whole new relationship to death, a whole new relationship to love, a whole new theory of identification. But all of that's reliant on a leader, a theory of the leader, right? Which again, if we just pause for a second, don't forget my question, and we reflect on what was happening in Western philosophy at this time, well, we had a kind of anti-humanist move, which not only anti-humanism, but a whole series of arguments, largely having to do with the critique of Stalinism in general, that was trying to basically say that the left no longer needs leaders.
Yeah, and it's not only that, but like I couldn't help but like your question is really interesting because I never really thought about it in this point. But I guess to answer it, like it makes me think like what Rosicrucian is doing with this idea of the leader that takes us out of, I think as you phrased it, this homogeneity of bourgeois culture and the artificial group is radically different than the prescription that say someone like Herbert Marcuse in Eros and Civilization, where it almost seems like a sort of Nietzschean Dionysian ideal, right? Which with like someone like him, Deleuze, Reich, we get these like Freudian Marxist tendencies where there's a fetishism of infantile pre-Oedipal sexuality, right? Which ultimately seems to be more narcissistic than it is liberating, and even could be captured by bourgeois ideology if I were to give a far reach. But what I like about what you were saying is like the invention of new leaders, new groups, because it puts into question what exactly the paternalistic function
Right.
substantiates is. And I know you'll be aware of this because of our Lacanian investigation, but the unary trait or the trait of identification first comes up in the group psychology work of Freud. And this aligns with what Freud will call the ego ideal, right? And so the ego ideal is a bunch of identifications founded on an ideal of the father, right? Because what he says in that chapter is that the first form of identification is going to be the child identifying with the position of the father, wanting to be like him, wanting to act like him. But then he will find his object cathexis in the mother's love. But during that time, and this takes place in the Oedipal complex, there'll be a rivalry between the father and the mother's love. But the reality is that he can only do so insofar as he's already assumed the ideal of the father, right? And so we see this repeat in these
Yeah.
groups. So I feel like from what you were saying, what
Right.
Rositchner is proposing is like a sort of leadership and a group founded on love, but not on narcissistic love, nor
There's that.
on the
Hmm.
identification of the father, which repeats all these Oedipal tendencies.
Right. Exactly. So, okay. So this whole distinction between ontogenetic and phylogenetic as this like
That's the
his
historical part, right?
it's a historical species level process of evolution, meaning that the theory of the myth of the primal father does not need to have a historical, anthropological, empirical verifiability. What it means is that at a ontogenetic, which would be like the individual organism, uh, because culture has uh, uh, concocted repression in the way that it has constituted itself in collective culture, the argument would be that there has to be a kind of confrontation with the problematic that the original confrontation or conflict brought about. In other words, it kind of exists as a side of a sort of aporia that any group must confront. And what Rositchner says about groups, by the way, I think this is essential, is that groups in capitalism are best understood as horde groups, meaning that even in the artificial groups, the structure of leadership still mirrors this general brutal, archaic form of identification. And therefore, and this is why in my review of Rositchner's book that we're talking about, I say that Freud reopens the Enlightenment. Okay? Because it's a very interesting theory here, which is that this archaic structure of identifications kind of keeps the logic of the group at a pre-Enlightenment form of identification. The thrust of the socialist and revolutionary movement could be the only source to adequately address the origin of what makes bourgeois groups complicit in archaic horde-like identifications. Precisely, and this is where Rositchner's Marxism comes in, precisely because they are constitutively founded off of a relation of capital and its system of domination. So you see where, I mean, in a sense, what I think Rositchner is giving us is like a kind of hyper socialist Enlightenment theory of revolution, and one in which he says we can forge a fraternal alliance that would be other than the homogeneity of the horde, right? That's what must be broken from. We must have a rupture from the horde. And yeah, it's something that, and he says that this drama of the primal horde, well, it's not totally true that the artificial group is a primal horde. It's more that primal hordes exist as a contradiction of the capitalist system. He says, but they're only um, readable in the present. And he says that only the revolutionary group or other types of breakaway groups from the artificial groups can touch their sort of composition or their reality and transcend them. So it's almost as if I guess what he's trying to say is that the primal horde structure exists as a kind of latent potential within capitalist institutions. Because I guess I don't want to suggest that uh the modern state bureaucracies or big corporations are horde structures. That's not exactly what he's saying. I think what he's saying is that in or that when you rebel against the artificial groups, you're sort of brought back into, and that makes total sense. I mean, this is the whole dynamic of like why radical politics on the right and the left fall back into cults. It's the same kind of logic. I think what he's trying to say is that there has to be a way to push against that cult horde structure in the construction of something new that would then be capable of rivaling an
Yes, and
artificial
that's a
group.
really good point because what the hordes are doing is in a sense an act of rebellion, but it goes back to what I was saying about like the whole thing about how identification is first instantiated from Freud's group. We can see Rositchner applying that in a Marxist sense by understanding how uh, you can say both the class struggle and the way different groups form as an act of rebellion, but they never really go so far. There's a sort of impetus, right? And I think it's
Yes.
indicative of the way in which they're doing it based upon certain identifications or an attempt at disidentification. But there's always that sort of narcissistic investment that sort of reels them back in, right? And so I feel like, yeah, this is what the emphasis of speculating um, the revolutionary group from the spontaneous one, because for the revolutionary group is something that Rositchner is thinking about. Freud talks about a spontaneous group, but he doesn't really theorize it, articulate it as much. So I think this is like one of the things in Fidelity of Freud that Rositchner is trying to really articulate more, and be like, well, Freud, you forgot to really expand upon this notion. You kind of gloss upon it and don't really touch upon what can come of that. And I also wonder, insofar as that him and Freud both ground groups not on the level of mesmerism and contagion, but on a libidinal tie, how much
Hmm.
sublimation operates in the construction of new ideals.
Oh, I think so. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's essential. Okay. In a way, if the Althusserian conception of the leader in theoretical anti-humanism is making this distinction between science and ideology, right? I would ask the question as to whether the socialist intellectual or the socialist leader in Althusser's conception of this distinction between science and ideology is is capable of concocting revolutionary ideals that forge forms of. So you see, like in Althusser, I don't see something like that as theorized. Whereas in Rositchner, I do see it theorized like that. And so there's now, I mean, I guess you could say sublimation, sure. I mean, in a certain way, um, if we understand sublimation as the act of the as a sort of act of cultural ideals itself, or a kind of the way that the subject kind of relates to common cultural ideals. In a way, I would say that perhaps the revolutionary effort would be to create the grounds for making new forms of sublimation possible. I'm not sure that we can say that, um, like, I feel that like a theory of sublimation would have to be thought only in the wake of or in the development of a more refined, I don't know, socialist society in a certain way. Because sublimation to me is almost this like kind of uh like a kind of like sort of sunk or situated condition that like say like how we relate to the degradation of labor, well we sublimate the toil of labor, or like but then sublimation also refers to this kind of like I guess collective sharing of a common ideal. So maybe you're right. I mean, I'm not sure. He doesn't. Does he talk about sublimation much? I'm not sure that he
No,
does.
yeah, no, I'm not sure either. It's something that I didn't really see, but I just wonder, given the fact that both him and Freud talk about the libidinal investment of groups, I wonder how sublimation would play. And especially given the fact that both the ideals and the culture are expressed through a death drive, if something like
Yes.
sublimation would,
It's
be implemented.
unsatisfied. It's
Yeah,
unsatisfied cultural frustrations.
exactly. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
that. It's that. And so I feel as if yes, uh, a revolutionary must like, and that's actually a real question for us today because like, if we take serious this look this serious because of Lacanian idea of the politics of enjoyment, and we have the sense that like political groups political groups find points of identification around collective dissatisfaction? And there's all of that stuff regarding like the discourse of authoritarian populism and the way that figures like Trump have been capable of doing that. So there's something to be analyzed there. And even in my interview with Bo Steels, the translator of the book, he made a reference to how Rositchner, in his book on bourgeois morality and revolution, performed like a discourse theory. So you probably would have to think some of those possibilities vis-a-vis a discourse theory. Otherwise, um, because it's hard to scale out like how we could think a particular, but perhaps another way to think about sublimation would be through like the Socialist Party in a certain way, where like the cultural wing of the Socialist Party could keep some kind of conception of sublimation in its own thinking about how to deal with collective dissatisfaction and how collective dissatisfaction is to be invested in. That's a very interesting question to think almost like social planning that would build into its own awareness the problem of sublimation. Like that would be, I suppose. I wonder if like in capitalist society, who does the work of accounting for sublimation?
Right, that is a good point, right?
I wonder, you know?
Yeah, because it almost seems like, and again, maybe there is something to like, adding the Lacanian theory to it of like, if there is something to the injunction to enjoy, well, in capitalism, we're met with constant dissatisfaction at the level of jouissance, insofar as that, like, now we're not even desiring anymore. It's rather the fulfillment of demand, right? The demand of the capitalist injunction on the level of not only enjoyment but on individualism, right? Um, and the rapid production and excess. But that might be a digression from, I think, the point that you were kind of bringing up about like social planning and the management of dissatisfaction. That's actually a good. I've never really thought of it like that. It's like, what would it look like to actually
Yeah,
address dissatisfaction, right? Rather than on the level of like what could bring satisfaction, which I think is more, that's more of a psychoanalytic way of like,
it
to
is. No, it definitely is. I would say it's a thinking of a kind of utopian project which would account for the persistence of aggression at a cultural level, irrespective of the exploitation of labor or the kind of degree of exploitation of labor. So there's a certain relationship there between, um, yeah, there's a certain, and I mean, a lot of theorists will argue that aesthetics become, like Cartani argues that aesthetics uh, should be the kind of site whereby this unsocial sociability and inborn aggression finds outlet, right? Uh, which is why he associates aesthetics with culture and the nation in his different modes of culture, nation, state. So
right, yeah.
so there's something to be thought there. Uh,
Well, I also
it,
even think at the level of like aesthetics, but even like going back to this idea of like the party, because going off topic, it makes me think of like some of your various talks, and I think even we talked about it too in our last conversation, but Return to Rhines by Didier Rabon, where he talks
oh
about
yeah,
how the party helped keep things like racism and other forms of aggression, hate in check. But after the dissolution of the Communist Party and the rise of neoliberalism, that came back more rampantly, right? So I wonder, if that is really something politically, but also thinking it from a psychoanalytic lens, like the importance of having that, right? And even, yeah, even aesthetics too, whether it's aesthetics, new forms of, I guess, like cultural entertainment, like, or sports. Because I think even like the USSR had their own form of, like, enjoyment of sports, but something that doesn't even like entertain like paternalistic identification and rivalry and aggression, because we see that in capitalist societies where, like, how many people are dying, because of sports team like Philly. You see, like, whether the Eagles win or lose, like, the city just goes into chaos and people start killing each other.
Yeah, I mean that's why Rositchner will say a very interesting point, which is that the distinction between, um, eros and thanatos, or the life instinct and the death instinct, he says is nothing but the interiorization of a form of culture or civilization that determines its different modes or manifestations, um, based upon like the this like inscription of the instinct that is experienced as natural, but which ideologically is not um, capable of seeing its cultural determination. And I felt that that's an interesting point, which uh, Rosichner almost gives us a certain theory of like bourgeois ideology in this distinction between like uh, instinct as it is determined both biologically and culturally. And he wants to say that at the origin of the implementation of the aggressive drive, right? Um, it is determined in the last instance by the system of production, and thereby culture can mediate that. But the human being will have the tendency to perceive the aggressive drive as fully biologized and not determined in this way. And it's that move that I see as highly ideological. I mean, it's like in a way, perhaps like socialists are perceived often as the ones who are like trying to disrupt something that should be understood as some kind of natural, organic process. When we're saying, no, no, this is fundamentally an inorganic aggressiveness, that this aggressiveness is contingent. I always have this debate with like family and loved ones, you know, about the nature of oppression in our society. I don't know how much you struggle with people at this level as well. Like, you know what I'm saying in terms of these like conceptions about the origin of some of, I mean, in other words, I'm fully convinced of Rosichners' point that the aggressive drive is fundamentally determined by the system of production.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But I don't think that this is a self-evident point.
Mm-mm.
Not at all. Like far from it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it requires a huge degree of education to even alert people to this fundamental point. Would
Yeah,
you would you say?
yeah, no, and I think it goes back to the way in which the system structures our subjectivity, in which we see things as naturalized, right? And even in the way in which, like, our discontent towards others makes us think that some people's suffering is just, oh, that's because of them, right? Some people are just born that way. These are just like the, idle chatter of like the everyday person. But I think within those unquestioned prejudices or statements are imbued with it, like the nucleus of like bourgeois symptoms, of insofar as that, like, it's not a rational expression, but it's sort of seen as natural, if that makes sense.
Yeah, he says that the diffusion of the death drive throughout society is a derivative. is a derivative effect which goes concealed by the predominant ideology, but which only class struggle can make legible or revealed.
Yeah.
And when he says something like that, like I'm immediately sold. Like I'm
Yeah.
immediately like he is exactly right. And you don't really find that in a lot of other psychoanalytic
No.
theoreticians.
No, not at all. But even like for Freud too, Freud is thinking the same thing. Even if he's not
True.
advocating socialism, he's he sees the what culture and relations produce, and the production of the symptom as well as a sort of like these techniques of
Well, that's true
alleviating
because that
suffering.
that is that is very true, and this is where science comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to mention this apropos Le Bon, but the point is here is very important to kind of pinpoint, which is that he makes a claim that what both Freud and Marx shared in common when they in terms of their understanding of science is that both thinkers, and this is why Freud is attacking Le Bon implicitly, both thinkers saw the function of science uh, as tied to the preservation of the aggressiveness of the dominated class. Meaning that Freud already theorizes aggression as an effect of the class domination and struggles. So therefore, this is fully affirmed by Freud. This
Yeah,
is fully affirmed.
and that's what Rositchner brings out too in the group psychology section of the text, because for him, even though Freud doesn't really attack Le Bon on his explicit political position in his text on the crowd, he still exemplifies what you said about the way in which aggression in science operates, and how this is sort of this science is indicative of the domination of a ruling class and even their consciousness imposed onto the social. And I really thought this was interesting because in one of the pages when he says this, he's also footnoting Lukács, but how Freud is a thinker of totality. In that, in this text, Freud, and this may be sort of simple to some people, but it's really radical in the Marxist sense, but even in Freud, in that individual psychology is always already social, right?
Mm.
That this is something that is bourgeois in nature when you divide an individual psychology from a social psychology, right? That even the analytic technique of the talk and cure, what we're doing at the level of the unconscious is sort of maneuvering the subject around the social symptom as it manifests on the level of their singularity. That's kind of Lacanian to express it, but what Freud is showing in his efforts, because they're in science, like everything that he's doing is sort of scientific, but he's also subverting, the dominant lens of science, as a clinician, but also as a social theorist, right? Um, but what Rositchner says is he gives like almost like 3 or 4 pages of just a bunch of references from Le Bon, and you see the vampant criticisms of the crowd, and even relating socialism and anarchism to criminality, right? Uh,
Right.
as if it's somewhat innate at a biological level, right? Of
Right.
criminality. But that's not what Freud is doing.
No, Freud's not doing that, even though obviously Freud's relationship to, I mean, one of the things I really appreciated about Rositchner's treatment of Freud's position on Bolshevism and communism in general is that, he does argue that because Freud faced ostracization as a Jewish scientist at the time, this led him to distance himself from communism because bourgeoisie in Central Europe, where Freud is based, associated communism with Judaism.
And there's also that thing that you constantly reference with Etienne Balibar, the construction of the
Right,
superego, right? Which
right.
is maybe you could tell the audience of
Yeah,
this
yeah,
text. It's this
yeah.
dialogue with Hans Kelsen, right? He's a jurist and a political thinker, right?
Right, yeah, I can briefly say it's a beautiful point, that Freud Freud's construction of the latter, you know how we talked about there's basically kind of like a sequence of the superego in Freud. There's this initial external concept of the censor, which comes from the authority of the father in social life, that is interiorized. But then there is the more elaborate theory of the superego that's developed after 1920 and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which the superego is the source of a more kind of primary uh, uh, imposition of a kind of natural theory of the death drive, and thereby of an inbuilt aggressiveness of the subject. Anyways, Bolivar argues that Freud theorizes this second theory of the superego as a way to confront the transition from after World War One of the ancien regime that had just been kind of like toppled with the wars, but also with 1917 and the impending possible spread of communism in Europe. Bolivar thinks that Freud basically tries to, and so does Karatani, uh, implant a theory of authority that would be of the old order and kind of com- concoct a conception of social stability into this theory of death drive superego in the mature version. And lo and behold, he thinks that Freud did this as a way to push against the antinomian basis of Bolshevism. And he's influenced by Hans Kelsen. Bolivar spends quite a lot of time showing how Kelsen read Freud and pressured him to derive this thought. And so it's worth looking at Bolivar's piece there. All of that obviously does not make Freud in line with communism at all. And I've thought and wrote and spoken a lot about Freud's relationship to communism. I think Rositchner gives us the best angle on this
Well, it's really
problem.
interesting. It's really interesting that you said it because I wanted to tie this question that I posed to you offline, but precisely Freud's relationship to communism, because in Civilization is Discontent, he has a vampant criticism of it when he talks about ways in which man has tried to alleviate suffering. And he brings up, because I think this the Civilization is Discontent is written right after the Bolshevik Revolution.
Well, no,
Or
I
like
think well
it's
that's actually
connected.
the naive thing. Sorry. So this actually, let me just say, in Civilizations is Contents, what Freud says about communism is a naive liberal reading of communism as like
Right.
absence of competition.
Exactly, because it's the he says that some people like the communists think that if we abolish private property, that we get rid of not only exploitation but the domination and aggression that's imbued within private property. And this is why I wanted to get your opinion on this, because what Rositchner says is that this is well, you brought up a good point. I didn't even think about this like this naive reading from a liberal standpoint, but
Yeah.
what Rositchner says is that this is actually a critique of utopian communism. Um,
Right.
and he brings up I always we did the 1844 manuscript reading, but you know how there's that chapter where Marx has the is it the four categories of communism, and he thinks that
Right.
it's one of those sort of utopian ones that Freud is kind of aligning with when he's critiquing communism, and he's kind of more aligned with Marx in his
Hmm.
criticism of utopian communism.
Yeah, I mean that's
It's yeah,
also that yeah, that reading is also a little bit cute. I
yeah,
mean, it is because first of all, it's very charitable to the possible fusion with Freud and Marx on the one hand. On the other hand, Freud does not possess that distinction at all. He just simply thinks that communism is that. He does not, you know what I'm saying? And that I think is for sure. So, but it's nice that Rosichner is able to do that because I think it shows his hermeneutic sophistication And in that sense, he's right. And we should follow him and agree with him. And that's why like he cuts this thing perfectly, you know? Um, because one has to subtract, I think, I mean, it really depends. Because he here it would be like a Freud and Nietzsche, right? In the sense that because Freud is a scientist who's uh, concocted these insights of subjectivity at the level that he's able to unearth them, it's incidental what his own political prescriptions are. Okay. But that's actually quite different than, say, than Nietzsche, precisely because Nietzsche is trying to think of a political community that would rival. This is a fully different level of what rises as political. In that sense, like Freud's politics with a small p are meaningless in a way. Do you see what I'm saying? I would
Yeah,
contend like
that's
that.
a good point. Yeah, because the key difference is it's at the level of Freud examining things as a scientist, and that's how he is. He's not a political theorist. Whereas, and I think you've said this before, whereas Nietzsche is looking at things from what you could call an aristocratic epistemology, right? I think it's Lukács that uses that, this sort of aristocratic insight, right?
It's not only that, it's that Nietzsche's whole conception of the human being is itself prior to its conception conceived of in a way which is attempting to um, foreclose questions of universal freedom, etc., etc. No, Freud is still on that terrain. Freud is still working in a kind of general egalitarian project. So thereby, he's siding with liberalism, which that's fine. You know, like that's an antagonism we can handle. I think Nietzsche's up to something more pernicious in a certain way because his ends are compromised in a different way. But okay, but back to this point. I mean, I guess the other point that he makes about communism and psychoanalysis, uh, yes, it's this point about utopia and a kind of Freud's against a kind of non-ent. But you know, here's the question I would put forward. In a way, the imagination that we as socialists have available for thinking, like we were saying, the kind of social planning of sublimation or the grounds for how human aggression can be circulated and exchanged if we have a socialistic society. I think we should be honest that we don't possess that knowledge now. We only possess the possibility of creating new ideals so that we could be in a position to construct that thought of that society. And that's a kind of fundamental that makes socialism a bit of a wager
Well,
in this kind of like Pascalian
yeah.
socialism of like Goldman.
Hmm. Well, what's interesting
Right.
is going back to what you were saying about the family and not necessarily like Rositchner is not trying to abolish the family when he
Right.
talks about the way in which the family institution sort of creates this paternalistic identification rivalry and narcissistic dependency on the mother. What's interesting about that passage of the criticism of communism on the level of Freud is that what he critiques is that sure we may get be able to get rid of the exploitation that private property bestows on man, but what the communists forget is that there is still an original exploitation and aggression on the bonds of man with woman at the level of the family that existed before private property. But I think in the Marxist sense, I'm not sure if I don't remember if Rositchner says this, but I'm like compelled to really think of Engels in his, origins of the family, right? As the original class struggle. So I think to be more Marxist on the side of Freud, what Freud kind of alludes is something originary at the level of domination in a libidinal tie with man and woman, the sexual relation, and also it's structuration around culture or civilization, right? And it becomes the nucleus for social reproduction for capitalism. So I think even though Freud tries to create this criticism of communism, he, in a sense, if we follow the hermeneutics of Rositchner, is still on the lines of a dialectical reading, because there, I think Engels helps us with looking at the family in that sense.
No, I think it's true. I think that the question of the abolition of bourgeois family in the sort of general Marxist tradition, in a way, you still can possess a kind of commitment to the abolition of the family. Um, but it's a question regarding the degree or the kind of intensity by which the rebellion incorporates subjectivity, undergoing the transformation of a form of family that would be determined in a bourgeois social context. It's about kind of subtracting the subjectivities of the family in the process of a institutional social transformation of that institution itself. So it's not so much about this hyper personalization, right? But it's again why I think that Rositchner's treatment of the father keeps the father very much as this metaphorical function and thereby does not think about abolishment, because you see the problem with Wilhelm Reich was that abolition of patriarchy in the family necessitated abolition of fathers as such. This is not Rositchner's view, because the abolition of the interrogation and the overcoming of the system of production, right? That will abolish that will abolish the bourgeois family, but it doesn't necessarily abolish the kind of core constitutive basis of family units. No, it would reorganize their composition with a new form of the division of labor. It was, you see the point. So it's a different, it's like not the Wilhelm Reich version of abolition. I think that's the key point.
Yeah, it's not the Wilhelm Reich or the D&G version, nor is it like a sort of, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're more of an expert in him, like the romanticization of the traditional family of like Christopher Lasch. This is something different, right?
Well, even Lash would still submit to not Lash does not really romanticize the traditional family per se. I think that's
Mhm.
a bit of a distorted reading of him.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
He's not really interested in that, I would say. I think maybe in the True and Only Heaven,
Hmm.
he has a sort of embrace of a kind of populism where he has said that socialism is determined to be dead. But when Lash is a socialist, I think that he would still submit to.
Yeah, yeah.
No, no, no. It's a very naive way of thinking about Christopher Lash in that way that people
Hmm.
do that. Yeah, that's funny that people do that. It's caught
Yeah, I
up.
mean, he's more complex than a lot of people would give him credit. I know, like you and Varn both have invested in his work, but he's someone who is invested in the family. The family was a huge question for him. And what is it? This like sort of post-Fordist transition into like neoliberalism, right? Which the family is in crisis, and then there's this sort of narcissistic investment into the workforce and these bourgeois institutions, right?
Right. Of course. No, for
Mm-hmm.
sure. For sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of second, third wave feminism got into these polemics with Lash that has resulted in a kind of a real strong confusion about his project.
Yeah.
But that's fine. We can work to clarify it.
Yeah. No, I mean, this has been a really great discussion. I really think I've exhausted all the comments and questions I've had around this really extraordinary text. I really think that everybody who's interested in Freud and Marxism or psychoanalysis as a whole should definitely read this work, because, like, I mean, Lacan has done this for me through and through and will continue to do this, change the way, I and maybe one would read Freud, but on the level of a social theory, I cannot see Freud the same after reading Rositchner's text on Freud's
Absolutely.
social writing. Um, it's
Absolutely.
something that you can't unsee. Like after reading these three works, the Civilization of Discontent, the New Lectures, and then the group psychology work.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, to a lesser extent than Moses and monotheism and totem and taboo, although they're kind of present in a way in the
Yeah.
background.
Yeah, they come up a bit, but yeah, the main ones because he dedicates two chapters to Civ and Discontent, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
group psychology, and it's a very methodological reading, as we pretty much displayed. And I think the key point that you pointed out is the hermeneutics, where he's able to grapple with a lot of Freud's arguments and then apply his
Oh
own.
yeah.
Yeah, but
No, no, I just thank you so much for this conversation. I found this work yeah, it sort of I was surprised that more Lacanians have not interrogated the work, and if, people are listening and they feel whatever way, I would just encourage people to dive into it. And I think more reviews need to be written on this work. Um, I think that yeah, like I've only seen my review, maybe a couple of others, but it hasn't really received the response that I would like for it to have.
yeah, I mean, the only two people is like you and then Bruno
I
are the
think
only ones,
so.
yeah, the only
Yeah.
ones. And a lot of his work is not translated in English, as we've said, like the Freud and Power one, which is other one on Freud. That one's
Freud and
all in
Power,
English.
right, right.
I think he also has some on Marx as well, but then like the ones like essays on materialism, all in Spanish. So it's like, and the
Yeah,
Augustine one, we need all that translated into English.
100%. Yeah. No, it's a very, very useful work to read, I think, at the level of for any researcher and writer to read precisely because of the cogency of how he writes
Yeah,
is
it's
also
it's very
mm,
dense. It's and the way it's structured is like he has
yeah.
like a huge passage from one of the given texts, and then he expands upon it, but it's not like he's doing an exegetical exercise for the sake of like expanding on what Freud says, but to give the historical truth uh to the reader about what Freud is saying and how we apply it to bourgeois society. I think you could probably like if you could produce it like
I
that.
was gonna say that's true. It's dense. Yes, it's dense. I slightly disagree though at the same time. I also find it just well refreshingly coherent, especially about so okay, I'll give you an example of what I mean. Why I think it's not too dense and coherent is precisely because he's able to cross huge conceptual vistas and chasms that usually take up entire books around certain problematics and fuse them all together into one. For example, this whole question that so many Freudian Marxists never derive an answer to, which is about group identifications in leadership. I would say let's say he solves it. You could say like he almost solves it. Um, this whole theory of the expansion of a theory of institutions and of the artificial groups. Elaborate, clear, amazing. The whole theory of the internal, external, and how the origin returns in the rebellion and how it begins and then at the very end in the rebellion it comes back, how all of that is fused together. So there's something comprehensive and very lucid in all of that. So I don't know, man. I'm of the view that this also feels almost like a complete work. Feels
Yeah,
almost
no, that's true.
like a
Well, and
complete work.
also he doesn't really use a lot of jargon too. He's using
No,
Freud's
that's
terms,
true.
but like he's not using like
He
signify.
doesn't make any he doesn't
Real.
make any neologisms up or much like that at all.
No, no, not at all. And he's sticking to like Freud's terms. Like you'll see, he'll use like reality testing. ego, libido instinct, like all these, you
Yes.
know. But
Yes.
yeah, I never even thought of it like that, but I think that is correct to say that he does really solve a lot of the questions about group identification that you see that are sort of riddled with problematics, like with
Right.
contemporary theory.
100%.
Yeah,
100%. No,
yeah.
it's so good. I'm so glad we talked about this. And there's so much more to be sort of, I have the pink
Oh,
hard copy.
you have the flowery one that's like,
Yeah. The soft cover. Yeah, that's cool.
yeah.
No, no, it's, and honestly, the other thing is, ever since I've read him, because he's convinced me the most, um, every time I talk about Freudian Marxism, he's in my mind. So it literally the book literally changed my view on Freudian Marxism as such. Like he literally, I think, gave us like the finest version of it. It's a pretty big accomplishment. It really is.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad we did this because maybe this will push people to read it and give it some more cred that it deserves.
Very enjoyable to read.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Well, I mean, if you don't have anything else to add, maybe we could end it right there. And thank you all, comrades. I mean, I love doing this, and it's not for anything. I'm not monetized. I'm not trying to be a podcaster. This is like, a way for people to learn stuff that they can't really access in the university, and push people to read great stuff and yeah, learn psychoanalysis. And thank you again, Daniel, for coming on. It's always a great pleasure to have you on here to talk about really cool ideas.
My pleasure, comrade. Really appreciate it.
All right, everybody, all the best. Tune in next time. Peace.